Hello and welcome. I want to talk in this video about the recent shootings by Elliot Rodger, the reactions and associations some are drawing from it, and the reluctance and outright dismissal of those unwilling to see the truth for what it is. I've worked with violent men for years, and younger men who have been on the cusp of acting out, quite possibly the next Elliot Rodger. And for people to make such a deliberate and obvious attempt to associate men who stand up for their rights and who have decided to live their lives as individuals with the actions of Elliot Rodger, I find it deplorable. Anyone who has a capacity for reason and logic can see clear as day that a man who has appreciation for his own self-worth and who'll defend his own integrity by non-association and by clearly defining what he will and won't accept, as a man who has made the conscious decision to better his own life on his terms, free from persecution and from violence. And looking at it objectively, I can understand why these associations are being made, and it's for a variety of reasons. One of them being men who give voice to injustice against males and declare their own individuality. They're being associated with violence because of a traditionalist viewpoint. The very act of a man speaking out for his own rights, in a declaration of self-ownership that rejects societal norms, is seen as an act of violence. And this viewpoint, it's one that seeks to selectively censor what is deemed acceptable and what isn't. And the other reasons I'm going to touch on, but with the issue of anger, where does anger come from? For most people, anger only arises when we feel a sense of injustice. We can't change the inevitable. We can't change death or taxes, so we accept it. But if we perceive we're being wronged against, and the situation can or should be changed, but no one is stepping up to effect that change, that's when true anger arises, which in turn leads to resentment and hostility. And when we look at Elliot Rodger, what we have are people assigning blame right across the board. We want to see Elliot's actions as an isolated case, completely divorced from our own nature. But if anything, Elliot is in many ways a direct mirror image of ourselves and of modern society. Elliot, he had a victim complex, and he was a self-entitled narcissist, and none of this is up for debate. In his mind, we all owed him. He was above us, he was deserving of greatness, and if we denied him, then that's an injustice and a crime to be avenged. And every perceived insult, every slight, he harbored it, he amplified it, and his inner world, it was toxic and barren, and pleasure was foreign to him. All there was a victim complex and pain. And people, though, they were merely objects to Elliot, objects who denied him and weren't paying him the adulation he felt he deserved, merely for existing. And it's not the best approach to fostering relationships. He'd built his inner reality to the point where he couldn't function with others, for fear of disrupting the reality he had created for himself. And this projection onto women, was of his own making. He felt females were deliberately seeking to hurt him and were conspiring against him, when really they didn't know him from Adam. And he had the belief, like many killers have had before him, that his actions would resonate so deeply that human nature would shift or transform entirely. Like I say, there's been some people who have aligned men going their own way with Elliot. And one reason potentially is because they're drawing associations between Rodger's thoughts on women and sexuality. And here and again, this says more about the person drawing these conclusions than it does about the truth. Elliot, he wrote about eradicating love and sexuality altogether, putting women in death camps, letting them die off, and that artificial insemination would replace the sex act, and sexuality and love, it would cease to exist and be wiped from our psyche. Myself, I've accepted long ago that the average person can only stand on the edge of the cliff looking down, but they will never make that leap, even if their lives and their rights are on the line. Because if you do, you abandon everything. You start from scratch. And people, they fear the pain and the potential dangers associated with that. If you look at the boys from Columbine, boys from Columbine, they talked about kicking off a revolution. So, I see where people are drawing similarities between Elliot and men going their own way. But this belief that MGTOWs are anarchists, that they're nihilists, is baseless. If anything, they live their lives with purpose and clarity, with no desire to act out violently. Yes, they reject the social order, because persecution against men and boys is unremitting, and it's increasing in severity and scope exponentially. It's a divorce from the state, from stereotypes, from unfair expectations, and from persecution. It's not a divorce from reality. And what every man who's woken up wants is going to be different. But what's universally relatable between those men is a desire for peace, for freedom, and for autonomy. And in regards to how women are viewed by a man going his own way, they're viewed with disappointment, with disdain. These men, they demand equality for and from women in every interaction. Their perception, their self-image, it's not reliant on a female's validation. What they want above all else for women is total equality. And what that means, that means stripping away all the privileges, not the rights, but the privileges afforded to females. It's stepping away from the table and rejecting the social contract to better one's own life. And that's the distinction between indifference and hate. And it's not a hard concept to grasp. And those that can't, they need to do some serious introspection and lay their ego to one side. And with Elliot, he was deeply resentful and jealous of other people. But, he was locked in a vacuum. He was still associating his self-worth with the messages that society fed him. And his value as a man, as a human being, was only valid if women and society gave him that validation. But, a man going his own way, he rejects this. And some seem to view this rejection as a declaration of war, as opposed to a declaration of independence. And as well, some people, they've associated Elliot's actions with Asperger's. But it's very dangerous to make that association. There's no basis for such a claim based on the track record of those with Asperger's. And yes, it was reported he was in sessions with a psychiatrist as a child for a number of years, and that he's also taking antipsychotic medication. But this medication, it's prescribed for a number of conditions. Anything from depression to post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've worked with psychotic clients before. And looking at Elliot's videos, I saw no evidence of psychosis. He spoke and acted with clarity and definitive intent. So, looking for one sole reason to attribute blame is just avoiding the issue. If this isn't psychosis, if he wasn't a psychopath, and there was no prior history of violence or aberrant behavior, then that demands that we look deeper, and at ourselves. Now, if we look at society, most men, they exist within a vacuum. Expectations on men are unrelenting. And bias against males is just one part of it. Now, isolating men from one another. Now, cutting off forms of communication between males and effectively emotionally castrating them. And indoctrinating them to the point where they associate their own self-worth solely with their role as a utility. Then you combine this with the threat of social exclusion. It's usually more than enough to keep the chain around a man's neck. And if we look at the detractors to men going their own way, we can see just how much they favour that chain. Most males, they're suffocating inside a self-imposed prison. Blame is turned inwards, and introspection equates to weakness. And this is societal perception. Emotional and social deprivation is key to forcing a man to conform. And it's this isolation, this deprivation, along with these expectations, that's the breeding ground for violence. And this pressure, it extends to all walks of life. The workplace, school, the family unit, prison. If we take the approach that Elliot Rodger is an isolated case, we're refusing to acknowledge that for every man that picks up a gun and goes on a rampage, there's another million behind him standing on the brink. Ask yourself, where in today's society does a young man get the chance to express his pain? What outlets do males have? All there is judgment and unrealistic pressures. So many young men I've spoken with, for them, the act of violence is just as much about revenge as it is escape. A reprieve from the judgment and the feelings of loss and failure. I look at Elliot Rodger and I see the faces of so many men, all living barren lives, seeing themselves as victims of mistreatment. So really, therapy, it isn't the answer here. And these young men, they're isolated, they're cut off from society. They're not going to reach out for help. Just look at the stigma we associate with the mentally ill. Why would they reach out? They're ticking time bombs, and none of us are mind readers. In their mind, the only option to alleviate their pain is death. So why not take their abusers out in the process? We don't provide these young men with avenues to channel their rage and pain, and this is the cost. And there's always going to be talk of males being more aggressive than females. That testosterone and male aggression are key elements. But this is just presumption. Females, they're just as violent, if not more so than men in a number of areas, which I'm going to touch on. But when we look at the brain, when we look at brain activity, how it reacts to stimulus, negative experiences in childhood can cause physiological changes in the brain. That person can then be predisposed to acting out in anger. And different trauma and stress can decrease brain serotonin levels and alter behavior. You take an animal and you cage it in solitary confinement, their serotonin drops. Then you let them loose in the general population and you get one aggressive animal. I've seen this with men who have spent considerable periods of time in isolation. They come out, carving themselves up just so they can feel something and alleviate pain. This is not normal. But it's not just the isolation. In your own life, in your own experience, you may have experienced bullying or micromanagement at work or at school. And this feeling of lack of control you have over your own life, it really does. It plays a major part in the build-up of aggression and aberrant thought. The human brain, without a certain regular amount of stimulation, it won't regulate properly. Your thinking, it becomes warped, it becomes disjointed. It causes you tremendous amounts of stress. And social isolation, it works in primarily the same way. And it's an unjustifiable punishment for a crime that's never been committed. And it's often stated that depression, that it's rage turned inwards. With Elliot and many other men I've worked with, the anger they directed at others didn't bring with it guilt, as it would with most people, but rather a feeling of empowerment. The anger was focused on devaluing others. It's far easier to feel rage and to act out than it is to heal. But to heal, that man needs to have the tools and the resources to enable that healing to take place. And yes, Elliot, he was in therapy for a number of years. But, psychiatry has never addressed the core issues facing men. It wouldn't dare. It's on shaky enough foundations as it is. And the young men I've worked with, the ones that have the most violent fantasies, the most violent urges, none of them were mentally ill. And very few of them had violent histories, or suffered abuse or early trauma. They'd been active in school, a lot of them played sports, and that experienced some degree of bullying, but no more than most. But a recurrent problem that I noticed was a number of them had reached a point in their life where they suddenly experienced isolation. Many had either gone to college or into work, and they found it alienating. They had no channel or outlet for expression. So, what do we get? Young men socially excluded from the tribe. They feel cast off, they feel unwanted. And these young men, they wall off their emotions, due to fear of judgment. And their natures, they're suppressed and denigrated as inherently evil and sick to begin with, by the media, by society on the whole. Plus, add all the pressure of everyday life. And all of this, it's a breeding ground for resentment and rage. And it has to come out, one way or another. And without the tools for self-analysis and control, it will result in violence. Yet, zero focus is placed on changing the way males are perceived and treated. All we do is increase the pressure and ignore their pain and denigrate them even more. Just look at how boys are told it's their fault that they're failing in school, rather than looking at how the education system is failing boys. And the nature versus nurture argument, whether our responses are adaptive or inherent, it's always up for debate, but both play a role. But I do believe, just from experience, that the human brain is far more reflexive than we give it credit. Males' inner lives, they're never examined other than to be criticised. Dismissing male suffering and allocating blame to male nature, it's an excuse. Because no one wants to look any deeper. And there's reasons for that. These spree murders, they're a modern phenomenon. And really, if you look at it, it's just rinse and repeat. A shooting occurs, people are shocked. Then life goes on as usual until the next one. And scholars and mental health professionals, they throw their hands in the air. People are confused. No one can connect the dots. So, what changed? Why do kids feel the need to massacre their entire school all of a sudden? Why do employees decide to slay the entire sales floor? You take away job satisfaction and replace it with poor working conditions, with extra hours, with bullying, harassment. A person who feels discriminated against and undervalued and rejected, they will in time act out. And the manner in which they do is dependent on that person's mindset. And with school killings, we see the same issues. And bullying is just one part of the problem. But the school system, it changed. Males suddenly became the target of a campaign of misandry that infringed on their basic human rights. And the same abuse and the same vitriol directed at males in open society has been amplified to an extreme degree within the confines of the classroom. And these boys, they find themselves in a pressure cooker, made to feel less than human, censored, and deprived of the right to express their masculinity or even free thought or emotion. They're told from day one that they're a walking abortion, and the blame resides solely on their shoulders, and that they're failures. And still, people shake their heads, asking, how can a boy kill in this day and age? Well, we need to look at the age in which we're living in. We love war. War equates to freedom. Equates to solidarity, to identity. Now, peace is what we hate. We've always hated it. Peace equates to bland conformity. The long grey line of manhood. To isolation, to meaninglessness. War means restoring traditional values. Everyone working together for the common good. It means everyone has a role and they matter. National pride and all that good stuff. It also means throwing your rights down the toilet and being disposable, but hey, at least you're alive, right? The pride and joy people feel, what people experienced, the patriotism that people felt, the pride that people felt when the Iraqi war kicked off. I mean, this wasn't just about revenge or self-protection. It was about individual liberation through violence and murder. Of course, we never even look to relate a supposed random shooting with over a decade of death and carnage. People instead, they just choose to focus on tangible things, like gun control instead. It's something they can identify, and it's almost reassuring. Just blame guns. It's far easier than holding up a mirror to ourselves. But men, I mean, they get blame, blame for violence on the whole, but the statistics, they tell a different story. I mean, if we look at female violence, women kill children on a scale that far exceeds males. I mean, they're far more abusive to children physically, and they engage in sexual assault against children at a disturbing rate. It's just society refuses to brand it as abuse the majority of the time. And females, they're committing domestic violence on par with males. And women are more likely to initiate this violence and use a weapon. And these statistics, they're readily available. And violence by women, it's condoned and celebrated in Western society. And it's seen as female empowerment. And still, more often than not, this violence is seen as excusable or minimized. I mean, if we look at the report by the FBI, the FBI's NIBRS report, it stated that 1 in 4 juvenile arrests are female, and that arrest rates for females since 1987 have overtaken the rates for males. Now, we have to put this into perspective. In the past decade, the number of incarcerated females has tripled. Now, here is a definitive pattern of escalation we've never seen the likes of. And the question is not whether this ability for women to be violent is present. It always has been. It's simply they feel more entitled to act this way. Plus, as we know, sentencing, it's so lenient it's a joke. And men are seen solely as the major perpetrators and deserving of it. But if we look only at men as the problem in our society, we're only addressing half the problem. I mean, we address this in terms of what it means for social implications, instead of attacking males. Then and only then can we get a broader understanding of the issue. So we need to look deeper. Thank you for your time.